So I am connected with your university because I've been doing some work on the curriculum, and that's been very interesting for me, but I don't teach there. So I was asked if I would do this guest presentation on the topic of tools and techniques for effective teaching. And I'm very, very interested in that topic. In fact, I wrote a chapter in a book, in a methodology book, and that's most of what I'm going to talk about today draws from that chapter, which is called Tools and Techniques for Effective Teaching. A little bit of background about myself, just so you know who I am. And I'm a retired English language teacher educator from UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And I worked there for over 30 years in the Department of TSL and Applied Linguistics. And you said it looked like my background was very academic. Actually, I was one of the more practical members of the faculty because I taught things like the teaching practicum and the methodology course. And I was also the coordinator for the university's English language program for students from abroad and also for all of our domestic students. So I did a lot of work with the actual students. I helped to train the teaching assistants who taught those courses for the students at the university. And as I mentioned, I taught some of the more practical courses in our curriculum. And what I'm going to talk about today grows out of the work that I did with our student teachers and our mentor teachers. So one of the courses in our curriculum, which is in many MA TESOL programs, is the practicum course, where people stand up in front of a class really for the first time ever, and they teach and they get feedback from either a supervising teacher, which is what I was, or a mentor teacher, which they usually had, that they were attached to the classroom of that mentor teacher. And what I found was that especially our undergraduate students, because we had an undergraduate minor in TESOL, many of them came in with a real lack of confidence and really no idea how to go about teaching. So one of the things that we did was to create, before the practicum course, an elective course, so students could take it only if they wanted to. They weren't required to take it, but if they felt a little bit self-conscious about teaching, or if they lacked confidence, they would take this course. So really we wanted that course to be as totally practical as possible and just give them the tools and the techniques for effective teaching. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm not going to be the only one doing the talking. And so I'm going to ask the two of you, and if Ryan shows up, the three of you, to do a little bit of reflecting and to answer a few really simple questions. They're not really, most of them are not right answer versus wrong answer, but just your opinions. So I look forward to that. Okay, let's see if I can get my PowerPoint up. There we go. Okay, can you guys all see the PowerPoint?
I can see it.
You can see it. Ha and Jen, can you see the PowerPoint okay? Yeah, okay, great. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and sort of talk at you at least a little bit of the time. So as I said, my name's Donna Brinton, and I'm just a guest presenter today for your course, and I'm going to share just some of my ideas about what makes an effective teacher and how can you become more effective by using a few really simple tools. And I think sometimes the easier the tool, the more effective it can be. So many of these are ones that successful teachers use all the time. They may be things that you already are familiar with, but sometimes we need a reminder to employ them in the classroom. Okay, so a little bit of an overview about what I'm going to teach about or talk about. So the first thing is, when we talk about effective teaching, what do we really mean by effective teaching. It's easy to say, oh, that teacher is effective in the classroom, or another teacher is not effective, but it's a little bit harder to come up with a definition of what we mean by effective teaching. This is one that I found in a chapter by Richards and Farrell, written in 2011, and I like the definition a lot. So they say, the notion of effective teaching, this is a quote from their article, the notion of effective teaching is a difficult one to pin down precisely because two teachers may both teach the same lesson from a textbook or teach from an identical lesson plan and yet teach it very differently. And at the same time, both of these lessons may be regarded as very effective. So it's really hard to say, you know, this is effective and this is not effective. Different teachers can be effective in different ways. And I would also say, for example, from my own teaching experience, sometimes when I've taught a lesson to two different groups, I've taught that lesson very differently, depending on kind of the configuration of the group and the personalities of the students in that group. And yet I might have felt, no matter whether I taught it one way or another way, that both of those lessons were effective. So I think that's what makes teaching effectively and defining what teaching effectively is so difficult. Okay, I'm going to ask you to take some notes on the next two slides. And I'll sort of tell you what notes to take, because then I'm going to ask you to look at something and give me your idea of which of the principles is coming into play. So let's look at some principles of effective teaching. And again, these are also from Richards and Farrell. So the first principle says, for a lesson to be effective, it reflects the professional standards expected of English language teachers. So you know that there are standards that govern our profession that say this is how we should, you know, comport ourselves in the classroom, or these are some of the things that we should do when we teach a particular lesson. And TSL, as an organization, for example, has written a lot of standards for teachers. Those are interesting to look at. So maybe if for number one, all you really need to write down is number one, professional standards, just so you remember that. Okay, can you do that? Just number one, professional standards. That's all you need to write. Number two says that effective teaching reflects a theoretically grounded and principled understanding of language teaching. So I think here you could probably just write down understanding of language teaching. What's the theory of language teaching? What's the methodology of language teaching? What's the way in which we rationalize the things that we do in the classroom? So simply, number two, understanding of language teaching. Okay, got that? Number three, effective teaching has to be effectively managed. So just write down number three, effectively managed. And by that we mean, is there a lesson plan that's been written that helps to guide the teacher in what he or she is doing in the classroom? And are the steps in that lesson plan in a logical order so that the teacher can follow them and so that the students understand, you know, what it is the teacher's doing? And also, for example, are the instructions or directions that the teacher gives to the student clear and easy for the students to understand? And this is one of the things that is really the hardest for novice teachers to accomplish in the classroom, but even very experienced teachers, and I will include myself in that, very often, you know, don't take enough time to give clear instructions. We assume that the students understand us, and then when they start to do an activity, it falls apart and you realize nobody understood what I was asking them to do. So number three, effectively managed. Okay? Number four, effective teaching provides appropriately structured and sequenced language experiences. Okay, so we've organized the classroom well, and we do number 1 and then number 2 and number 3, probably starting with the easiest and then moving on to more difficult steps in the lesson so that we don't confuse the students in the process, right? So number 4, probably if you just write down structured and sequenced language experiences. Okay, so we have number 1 again, professional standards. Number 2, understanding of language teaching. Number 3, effectively managed or effective management. Number 4, structured and sequenced language experiences. Okay, there are 4 more principles according to Richards and Farrell. So number 5 says that effective teaching provides opportunities for learners to process and practice using language in a meaningful way. Okay, so we want to make sure that it's not the teacher doing all of the talking, that there are things that the learners in the classroom are being asked to do, and that what they're being asked to do is a useful thing that will help to expand their linguistic repertoire, that will help them speak English in a more meaningful way, right? And so basically here, if you write down number 5, opportunities to use language in a meaningful way, or maybe more simply, opportunities to use language meaningfully. Number 6 says effective teaching creates the motivation to learn and provides opportunities for success. I think the most important thing here is motivation to learn. So number 6, we could simply say motivation for learners or motivation to learn. And if you've taken language courses, which I know you have, and certainly I have too, I've been in language classes that were not very motivating, especially because I'm a little bit older than all of you. And some of the methodologies that I learned from were really just listen and repeat, grammar translation, for example, or audiolingualism, which you probably have learned about in your classes. And that was not really always very motivating because it didn't give us a chance to talk about what we wanted to talk about as learners. It just made us repeat what was in the textbook. And that didn't provide me with a motivation to learn. So I blame my lack of French proficiency on my teacher who didn't give me a motivation to learn. Okay, number 7, effective teaching achieves meaningful learning outcomes. So simply meaningful learning. Whatever we're doing in our class, it should be meaningful to the learners. It's very similar really to number 6, right? If it's not meaningful, we're not going to be very motivated to learn, and vice versa. Okay, so 7, meaningful learning. And the final principle, according to our authors, is effective teaching reflects your personal philosophy of teaching. So maybe here you could just write personal philosophy. And maybe we could think about why it's important to have a personal philosophy of teaching. If the way that we're teaching doesn't reflect our personal philosophy, we're probably not going to be very enthusiastic teachers or very excited about going into the classroom. And I can tell you from my personal experience that, for example, I was, when I first started teaching, I didn't teach English, I taught German. And this was during the audiolingual approach where all we did was drill, repeat, right, with our students. And I didn't really think that that was a great way to teach. And probably as a result, I wasn't the most enthusiastic teacher of German. Later, I gave up teaching German and began teaching English and found different methodologies that were more in keeping with my personal philosophy. Okay, everything clear? The 8 principles, do you feel pretty confident about them? You can give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay, yes, or a smile, that's good. You smiled, so I'm gonna assume that you're okay with that. Okay, now I'm gonna give you just a little sort of self-quiz. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna give you just a minute to look at some statements. So on the next slide, you're gonna have some statements about teaching. And what I'm gonna ask you to do is decide with that statement, which principle is the most relevant principle. So just to give you a hint, there's one number for each one and only one. So you can kind of use a process of elimination if you want as well. So for example, there's only number one or only one number 8. So you can guess and maybe do your best to sort of figure out which is which. Okay, so here are our statements. The first statement says, the teacher is familiar with instructional methods and their underlying principles, effective classroom techniques, materials, and assessment strategies. So I'm going to ask you to think about whether this is principle number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8, right? I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about these. Second one says, the teacher sequences activities that lead toward the successful completion of lesson goals and objectives. Next one, the teacher accesses specific and observable skills or competencies at the end of the lesson. Next one, the teacher negotiates an understanding of the competencies or skills the course is addressing, then refers to these in planning and reviewing lessons. Next one, the teacher carefully plans lessons, controls emotions and behavior in and out of the classroom, and shows respect for the students. The teacher teaches in his or her own way, based on personality and the way she views the teacher's role in the classroom. I think that one's pretty easy. The teacher develops a classroom atmosphere that encourages and motivates students in their learning. And the final one, creates a positive environment for learning and develops and enforces clear classroom procedures. Okay, so I would say again, use elimination, start with the one that's most obvious and put a number next to it. So there are 8 statements here and there are 8 principles, and see what you can do, okay? If you don't get them all right, that's not critical. I'll sort of explain why each one fits the principle that I think it fits, okay? So I'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes to look through these and see if you can match a principle with the statements here on the screen, okay? If you were in the same place, I would have you do this as group work. Unfortunately, we can't do it as group work because everybody's in a different place, but it would be easier to do as group work because then you could talk to each other and try to figure out the answers a little bit better. Do you need more time or are you okay?
I need a little more time.
A little more time. Okay,
Yeah.
give me a little more time. No problem. No problem. Okay, how are we doing now? Ready to see what we can do with these? We don't need to have them all right. It's not real critical. I just wanted to sort of get you thinking a little bit critically about what we mean when we talk about effective teaching. So with that very first statement, is familiar with instructional methods and their underlying principles. Which one of the original statements 1 through 8 do you think that one might reflect?
I put the third one, the
You
effective.
put 3, okay? And
I put the professional standard.
which number?
Number one.
Number
The
1.
first.
So number 1 or number 3? Okay, let's see what I had here. I actually had number 2.
Yeah.
Okay, because, okay, if they're familiar with instructional methods and techniques and materials and assessment, that's really a statement about knowing the methodology of language teaching, right? So number 2 said this reflects a theoretically grounded and principled understanding of language teaching. This is everything in one statement. It's everything about the sort of theoretical methods behind what effective teaching is all about. What about the next one, sequences activities? What number did you have?
7.
7? And?
I choose 3.
Okay, 7 or 3, let's see. Oh, we're not doing so well here. Okay, so sequences activities, that the key word there that should kind of clue you in there is the word sequencing. So sequences activities that lead towards successful completion. And if you look at number 4, principle number 4 said structured and sequenced language experiences. So the main thing here is to remember that, you know, sequencing activities in your classroom is a really important part of language teaching. And it's a really important part of what we mean by effective teaching. If we put things in the wrong order, we can confuse students if we start with more difficult things and then do easier things, for example. So we typically sequence from simple to complex. Okay, what about the next one? Accesses specific and observable skills or competencies at the end of the lesson. What did you have for that one? Obviously not number 2 or number 4. Shouldn't be.
I think
Huh?
number 7.
Number 7, and Jen?
That one's, I didn't
You didn't,
use that
okay,
one.
that's
Yeah.
okay. Ha, you're right. Number 7. Okay, so accesses specific and observable skills or competencies at the end of the lesson. And number 7 said meaningful learning outcomes. Outcome is what happens at the end of the lesson. So you're really right about that one, right? Okay, next one said negotiates an understanding of the competencies or skills the course is addressing and refers to these in planning and reviewing lessons. Any ideas for that one? Ha, what did you have?
Maybe number 1.
Number 1. Jen, did you have something for that one?
No, but I'm thinking it might be number 3.
Okay, I
that
think it
one.
might number 3 or number 1. Oh, I have number 5 here. I'm not meaning to confuse you guys here. I'm sorry about that. But my idea here is that you're providing opportunities for the learners to use language in a meaningful way. So you're negotiating the skills and you're using these. What about carefully, sorry, yeah, question?
Is it the negotiation between the students and the teacher?
No, this is more more the teacher negotiating the lesson, the shape of the lesson.
But
Yeah.
because when I read the principle number 5, I think about the negotiation between the teacher and the students, discussion among them during the lesson.
Which is a really important part of effective teaching too. And maybe we're not capturing that, or maybe this whole thing is not capturing that quite as much as it should. Let's go on and see, maybe come back to that. But that's a really good point. Okay, carefully plans lessons, controls emotions, shows respect for students. So carefully plans lessons. What do you think? Obviously not 2, 4, 7, or 5, so which one do you think fits there?
3.
Number 3? Okay, and Jen, you think number 3, or what do you think?
Thinking maybe number 1.
Okay, 1 or okay, all right. Number 1 is what I had here. So this is that whole idea of what are professional standards. Professional standards outline for us how we plan a lesson, how we control emotions, how we show respect for our students. That's an important part of the standards. Okay, the next one I think was kind of a dead giveaway. It was really pretty easy. But that was maybe the easiest of them. So teaches in his or her own way. What number did you have?
8.
8. Jen, same thing?
I agree with her.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. You're right. It's 8. Okay, so this is the idea of creating your own personal philosophy of teaching. So we may read about a lot of different methodologies, which we do usually in a methodology course, but ultimately, if you ask experienced teachers, what methodology do you use? Their answer will almost always be, well, eclectic. I sort of pick and choose from the things that work best for me. And that's a personal philosophy of teaching. Okay, last 2, develops a classroom atmosphere that encourages and motivates students. What do you think about that one?
6.
6. Very good. Okay, and the last one, creates a positive environment for learning.
3.
Got to be 3, because that's the only one we haven't done yet. Yeah, effectively managing the lesson by enforcing classroom procedures. Okay, I'm sorry if those were a little bit difficult, but maybe my main goal was just to get you thinking about the kinds of things that belong to this whole act of effective teaching. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few tools and techniques. There are many, many more. I don't have time to talk about all of them. What I tried to do is pick out ones that I think are really extremely important ones. But under that last box that says classroom discourse, I'm only going to talk about one, which may be new to you, the idea of IRE versus IRF. Sounds a little bit confusing, but I will explain it as clearly as I can. There are a lot of other things that fall into that box, like teacher questions, the kinds of questions that we ask students, teacher instructions, how do we give instructions clearly? And I'm not going to have time to talk about all of those, but what I want to sort of say here is that classroom discourse is an extremely important area of effective teaching. We can ruin a really well-planned lesson by, using the wrong kind of classroom discourse, and I'll try to explain that a little bit. Okay, so tools and techniques, lesson warm-ups, including icebreakers, wait time, the way we configure a class, like whole class, pair work, group work, and then that final area of classroom discourse. And I'll talk about each one of them sort of separately. So starting with lesson warm-up, and you all, you know what a lesson warm-up is, right? It's that very beginning segment of the class where we try to get the learners engaged in the class, and we break the sort of the atmosphere where they're coming from outside, they come into our class, and one of the things that we want to do is make them feel basically relaxed in the class and eager to learn, right? So the lesson warm-up, real simply, is the very first stage of the lesson. Sometimes teachers feel pressed for time, and they say, well, I don't have time for a lesson warm-up today because we've got so many things we need to do. Let's start right away with, one of the main activities in the classroom. And at least in terms of the literature tells us that's really not a good idea, because when we start immediately with activities that are maybe more cognitively challenging, we don't give the learners the time to sort of engage and get ready for the lesson. And I'll talk a little bit about the research. So this is very old research, but according to Edelhoff, who wrote an article in 1981, what we do during lesson warm-up is we sort of begin to tap the interest of the learners. We begin to sort of arouse their interest in the classroom activity, and we begin to sort of let them know what's going to be going on in today's lesson with some kind of an activity that should be related to the lesson that we're going to be doing. And again, sometimes, because I do a lot of teacher observation, we see teachers who think that a lesson warm-up should just be some kind of fun game. And basically, my idea here is that a fun game is not really an effective warm-up if it's not connected to the content of the lesson. So it should be in some way tied to, we could have a fun game, but the fun game would have to be connected with the content of the lesson. Okay, so here's what classroom research tells us about the value of lesson warm-ups. It says, first of all, when you greet the students and you say, good morning and nice to see you guys, that is a type of lesson warm-up. That's the beginning of your lesson warm-up, and that sets a positive atmosphere or not, depending on, things like whether you even smile at your students or not can have a very, very big impact on the learning of the students. And again, I'm saying this from my experience as someone who's done thousands of teacher observations. If you're nervous and you're sort of like frowning, that's going to reflect on the students. The students are going to feel like you don't really want to be in the classroom with them, and that will impact their learning. Okay, the lesson review portion of the warm-up aids concentration. So you may review something from the previous day's lesson to make the students feel like, great, we're all on the same page, we all know what we're doing, you guys did really great yesterday because you all understand, what we covered yesterday, now we're going to continue on with something new. Routine is a very big part of teaching in general. Students like routine because it makes them comfortable. And so they feel like, I know what's going to go on in this classroom. And especially routines in the warm-up stage, like even something as simple as asking students a few, personal questions about what's going on in their lives. They appreciate that in general. I'm not saying that you should pry into their lives and things that you shouldn't be asking about, but just, how are you feeling? What's going on? Even such things as, I like what you have on today. You look really good today. And this is true of basically any class that you teach, whether it's young children or whether it's teenagers or whether it's adults. And then the lesson warm-up does help you in getting your students' attention. It helps reduce anxiety on the part of the students and maybe also on your part as well, because once you see the students reacting, then you become less anxious. It increases everybody's motivation, and it can help to establish a lesson theme.
Yeah. May I ask you one question?
Sure.
Related to the first one, greetings. At my school, the students in the beginning level, they are very eager to learn. And when the teacher greet them, they will greet happily. But when they move to the higher level, greetings becomes like less effective. When the teacher say the greet to them, they respond tiredly, and they even don't want to respond. How can I do?
I think that probably has to do with the kind of greeting that you're using. So if it's just, good morning, everybody, and you want them to kind of repeat, good morning, you're right. Younger learners or learners who are in more beginning levels are really happy to just repeat a greeting. But I think that more advanced learners probably want more of a challenge. So what's setting in there might just be boredom, that they are not interested because they've heard it so many times. So maybe finding different ways of greeting the students or different ways of structuring that sort of warm-up activity so it's a little bit more challenging. When there's no challenge, students aren't so interested. That would be my guess.
But when we try to change our ways we greet them, because that way is so strange, they cannot respond and they don't understand what is going on.
Well, okay, because you need to teach them the new ways, right? And so, you need to introduce new ways and let them know, now we're going to try, this is new. We're not saying good morning, but we're using some different form of greeting. Here's the new greeting we're going to use, and we're going to practice this one. Yeah, so you don't want to confuse them with new greetings, but give them a challenge in the sense that we're going to sort of, we say in English, up the ante, make it a little bit more difficult for them and a little bit more challenging. Good question, huh? Thank you a lot. Yeah. Okay, any other questions there? Okay. Well, I don't know how much time we have. I don't want to spend too much time here, but let's just look at some icebreaker activities and then you guys can tell me what you think. Here's an idea of an icebreaker activity that I learned from other teachers. It was actually in a workshop that I attended, and they said, okay, you're going to have you're all in this workshop, nobody knows anybody. So this would be for a group of students that don't know each other at all. It would be a possible first day activity for maybe a little bit more advanced students. And you can vary the categories. I just put a lot of categories over on the right. Maybe you only want to use 5 of those, things that might be more meaningful to your students. And you could add other ones that you think are more familiar. The idea is that 2 students sit together and they try to, for each category, let's say, for example, favorite cities, they try to find something that they share. So, if you and I were sitting down and we were saying, okay, let's talk about favorite cities. What are your favorite cities? What are my favorite cities? Oh, one of your favorite cities is Ho Chi Minh City. Well, it was one of my favorites too. I loved that city. It was marvelous. So now we have something in common. Or let's take the category pets. We could say, okay, like what kind of pets do you like? What kind of pets have you had in the past? And we might find, that we are big cat fans or I happen to have birds, so lots of people don't like birds very much, but that's my favorite pet. So if I'm sitting with somebody else who happens to really like birds or had a bird when they were a child, now we found something in common. So that's one possible icebreaker activity. And like I said, you can choose the categories. I just put a bunch of categories up there to give you some ideas. If you had younger learners, pets would be a good one. It might not be such a good one for older learners. Family members is a good one for younger learners or learners who are less proficient. If you have a lot of boys in the class, maybe sports is a good one, etc. Okay, here's another icebreaker activity. Maybe you're familiar with this one. This is sometimes called speed dating. Have you heard that term? So what you do is you see the yellow circle in the middle. You have half of your students standing in the inner circle, and in the inner circle, they're facing outward. So they are actually facing the other students who are pictured in green there, who are facing inward. So you have students on the inside facing outward, students on the outside of the circle facing inward, and you give them a topic. The topic might be, what do you like most about your friends? What do you think is the characteristic of a good friend? Or what are your favorite cultural traditions? Or what's a challenge that you have in your life right now? And then you have them talk to each other for a timed amount of a period of time. Maybe it's 1 minute, and you might set a timer, and then you say, okay, everybody, now move. So the outside circle is going to move now counterclockwise, and this way the students all get a chance to talk with each other. The nice thing I think about this activity is that you can tie the theme or the topic to the lesson that you're teaching. So if the lesson that you're teaching is about the weather, then you could have the students talking about what kind of weather do you really like, what kind of weather do you dislike, something like that. Okay, these are two possible icebreaker activities. Any questions or comments about those? Again, they wouldn't be appropriate for all levels of students, and maybe you think the students I have wouldn't be able to do this. This particular one is pretty hard to manage in terms of the sort of classroom, because you have to have very, very good classroom management skills to get the students in the circle and to make sure that they move when you ask them to move.
I agree with you. I think that the first icebreaker is suitable for my classroom, because my classroom is not large enough for the second icebreaker. And the first one is the thing that I usually do, but actually I just ask my students to ask for personal information of each other, rather than ask for the pets or the personality or something like that. Maybe I will grade the level of the activities. For the beginning, I think that personal information is enough. But for the higher level, maybe we ask for some common characteristics between them.
Yeah, exactly. So you can tailor, the topics that you have them talk about to the level of the students. Yeah, and good point that this other one, the second activity, would take more space in the classroom, and like I said, it can be difficult to manage. So there are advantages of certain types of activities over others. Okay. Let me talk about wait time. Wait time basically means the amount of time that you give students when you ask a question to answer that question. And all of us have had that experience where we ask a question in the class and nobody answers. Or it takes the students a long time to answer the question. And from the teacher's perspective, that amount of time can be very, very painful. You're standing there thinking, nobody's going to answer my question. But I want to talk a little bit about what research has to tell us about wait time and the importance of wait time. Okay, so obviously second language learners can be shy. They're reticent to use the new language. They may not know the answer, or they may, and this is more likely, need more time to think about it. It's easy to think, oh, I asked a question, the student should answer right away. But if they're second language learners, which all of our students are, they may need more what we call processing time, right? To formulate their answer, to think about the vocabulary. Very often they're sort of agonizing over the choice of vocabulary. So this wait time can be extremely important. Here's what research tells us. So Noonan and Lamb in 1996 studied wait time in a large number of classes. And what they found when they studied the wait time is that on the average, teachers allowed 1 second between asking the question and getting the answer. If say student A didn't answer the question, they moved on to student B within 1 second, okay? Now, is that good or bad? According to the researchers, this isn't an optimal thing to do in the classroom. It's not really good classroom practice. So assuming no answer on the part of the student, sometimes they would move on, or sometimes they would repeat the question exactly the same, or sometimes they would reformulate the question, ask it slightly differently. Okay, so 1 second of wait time. Here's our teacher, Mr. Roberts, and he's saying, okay, Maria, what's the answer to number 4? And she says, and immediately within 1 second, he moves on to another student, Juan, who answers the question correctly. How does Maria feel? Maybe Maria knew the answer to the question, but she was trying to practice the answer so that she had correct grammar, or she was worried about her pronunciation, but she's left feeling like Mr. Roberts figured she didn't know the answer, right? So that can be demotivating, especially according to the research. Okay, so here's what the research shows us. It says that if you leave more time, anything from 3 to 5 seconds of wait time is what is considered optimal by the research. Here's what happens. Learners' failure to respond decreases, so more learners answer. The length and the complexity of learner responses increases, so the students say more, and what they say is more complex and more linguistically sophisticated. More students participate willingly, and students actually ask questions of their own. And they may also respond even when they're not called on. So unsolicited responses increase. This is research from Jack Richards and Dick Schmidt in 2010. I think it's really important for us to look at classroom research to figure out, what is really effective teaching. So I think these research findings are really important. What they tell us is try to be more patient with your students and give them more time to answer questions. It may feel difficult for you as a teacher to stand there and wait for the learners. Nobody likes to wait. And when there's dead silence, it makes you feel like, oh my God, is my lesson going to be complete failure? But in fact, what the learners are doing very often is they're rehearsing in their heads. They're thinking about what the correct answer is, and they need, remember back to our principles of effective teaching, they need effective strategies. Okay, so here's some things you could do. Yeah, go ahead, sure.
How can I do in the case that I have given my students 3 or 5 seconds to think, and then I even give them some hints to find out the answer. They cannot answer the question. Why other students want to answer? Can I move to other students or?
Sure. I mean, there are always going to be students who can't answer the question. It's just that we don't want to cut them off after 1 second. Yeah, so yeah, if after 5 seconds they don't answer the question, then you shouldn't just wait for another 10 or 15 or 20 seconds. That wouldn't be good classroom practice. But I'm going to suggest a couple other things that maybe you could do to help your students answer the questions. So here's some strategies. One would be simply count to 3 silently, in your head, just so that you're holding yourself accountable to giving your students adequate wait time. That's one strategy. Another strategy, don't look straight at them and make them nervous while, you're counting to 3. Look someplace else in the classroom, look, down to the floor, And then when you sense that the students are ready, then you make eye contact, right? So eye contact can be kind of negative. And then I think the most important or the most effective strategy of all, if you can afford this time in your classroom, is to say, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put you in a group and I'm going to give you the questions and you're going to answer them just for yourselves in your group or in pairs, either one, whichever one is easier for you in your classroom configuration. And now I'm going to ask the questions again because the students have then had a chance to rehearse. And they're much, much more likely to answer your question if you do that. I tell this to student teachers all the time who say, my students won't answer any questions. And I say, let's try this next time I observe you and see if it works. And generally it does. So those are just 3 useful strategies for teachers. Questions there, or that's pretty clear? Okay. Sean, I need to ask how we're doing on time.
You can continue with your presentation. That's totally fine. What you have to say is very, very interesting, and I don't want to cut you off.
Okay, maybe about 15 or 20 more minutes. Will that be okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's absolutely fine.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, so pair and group work. Very important in the communicative language classroom, right? But as a teacher, one of the things that you need to figure out in your lesson plan is, how am I going to do each activity in my lesson plan? Is it going to be a whole class activity where I just get everybody working together, just maybe shouting out answers? Am I going to pair students to do the activity and then give me the answers that they've worked out? Or am I going to put them in groups? And there are solid reasons behind each one of these configurations so that we can kind of construct some rules that help us decide, should it be a whole class activity? Should it be a paired activity? Should it be a group activity? So this is a decision you have to make as a teacher. And really, it should be a part of your lesson planning. You shouldn't just decide on the spot, oh, I think I'll do a pair activity here. You should have planned that out in advance. If we pair or group learners, either pair them or put them in small groups, this is probably the best way that we can help them acquire language in the classroom setting, because they're listening to others and their anxiety level is much lower than if we're just calling on students individually. And so they really are engaged in the acquisition process. Okay, so one of the things that we need to do is, when we're structuring our tasks in the language classroom, we need the learners to interact with their peers. We need, you mentioned before, you mentioned that idea of negotiation of meaning, right? So we need them to negotiate meaning with each other. That's a very important principle of, of language acquisition. And we want them to share their personal opinions. That goes back to our principle of motivating learners, right? We want them to talk about things that matter to them. All right. So I'm going to just sort of put you on the spot here. I have a bunch of situations, and we're going to decide, if you were planning a lesson for each one of these activities, what would you do? Would you decide, I'm going to do this as a whole class activity? I'm going to do this as a pair activity, or I'm going to do it as a group activity. So maybe we can think for each one of these why it might be, and there's not necessarily just one answer. We might say this could work as a pair activity or as a whole group activity, or this could work as a group activity or as a whole class activity. But let's try to pick the one that we think would be the most useful. Okay, so here's our question. Which format do we use? WC means whole class, P means pair work, G means group work. Okay, so if we want to make our students feel like we all belong together, we're all part of a class, and our class is an important part of our identity, which one would you say? Whole class, pair, or group? These are pretty obvious, really. These are much easier than the last task I gave you. What do you think? Whole class, pair, or group?
think
Jen?
I think
or-
the first thing would be I would think whole class, but then again, with the whole class, you could have maybe a couple students that wouldn't want to really respond as much. So I would still want more people to be more involved. So maybe group would probably be better where you're in a smaller, you know, you're still, it's not like just one other person, but at least you're talking to more than just one person.
Okay. Okay, so you're saying it could be whole class or it could be group.
More
And I
so
would say
group, I would
maybe,
say.
yeah, I think you're right. I would tend toward whole class, but I think the point that you're making that, some students might not want to, be part of the whole class. In every class, you've got a couple of those. Yeah. So you know your own learners and you make your decisions based on that. If you've got a bunch of students that really don't like to work, sort of in a unified group, you might choose group. But I would say maybe the most logical answer here might be whole class. Okay, practice a dialogue. This one is pretty obvious.
Pair work.
Pair work, yeah, because we can't do a dialogue with a large group or with a whole class. Or we could split the class in half. Sometimes I've seen teachers do jazz chants, for example, with half the class reads one part of the jazz chant and half the class reads the other part. But generally, I would say here, yeah, pair work. Okay, jigsaw reading or listening. Are you familiar with those terms, jigsaw? So jigsaw means that we've got, if it's a reading, I might cut the reading into 4 pieces and each student reads only one part and then they share what they learned from their piece of the reading with other students. I just gave you the answer, kind of.
Pair work or group work is okay, but I choose group work.
Okay, it depends on how many pieces, right? If I cut it in 2 pieces, then I'd do it as pair work. But usually with a jigsaw, we have more than 2 pieces. Usually it's 4 pieces or 5 pieces. I think 4 is maybe the most common. So I would say group work. Okay, increasing student interaction opportunities. So I want students to speak as much as possible in the class. What
Yes.
format would achieve that?
Maybe pair work.
Whole class will help us to do this.
Okay,
Just
whole
like
class.
icebreaker number 2.
Okay, yeah. I would say here. So notice I circled them both. So I said pair or group work. Whole class if we have everybody just repeating, but it's hard to get a real meaningful conversation going with your whole class. So I think putting students in pairs and having them talk about something like solve a problem or putting them in a small group to solve a problem would give them lots of interaction opportunities. Okay, encouraging cooperation and negotiation. What do you think there?
Group work.
Group work or pair work, right? Probably group work more because they have to negotiate more with different personalities. Right? And that's sort of a life skill that very often we're trying to reinforce in the classroom. Presenting new material. So I'm the teacher and I'm presenting a new grammar point or I'm presenting a reading skill.
Whole class.
Difficult to do in pairs or groups because once you put students in a pair or a group, they sort of go into their own world. So I would say that's a pretty clear example of when we'd want to use a whole class format. Quickly check answers on a task.
Pair work.
Pair work, okay. Discuss answers on a task.
Group work.
Probably group work because they'd get more opinions, right? And they'd have to work it out a little bit more. Giving task instructions.
Whole class.
Okay, I'm the teacher and I'm going to give the instructions for the next task that we're going to do. The classic mistake that teachers make, and I make this all the time too, is they put the students in groups first and they say, now here's what we're going to do. And nobody's listening because they're already talking to their group members, right? And then just to gauge the mood of your class, to feel like, what's my class today? Are they kind of exhausted or was it Monday and they're just not quite back in the mood for learning?
Whole class.
Probably whole class. Okay. So there are reasons behind why we use different formats, and we have to think about those in advance. Okay, a little bit of research again here. What's the rationale for doing pair and group work? And again, this is all from the literature. So one, it means that we no longer have a dominant teacher, so we're reducing teacher dominance. It's not a teacher-dominated classroom, but it's a student-centered classroom, and we talk a lot about that in our methods classes. It allows for both the practice of productive and receptive skills. Students are talking at the same time that other students are listening, and they're having to listen to what their partners are saying in either pair or group work. They get an increased opportunity to speak and interact and to share personal knowledge and experiences if we give them well-constructed tasks, right? Next one I think is really important. You see there the term linguistic risk-taking, and that means that the students are trying to say something that's maybe a little bit above their current level of language proficiency. We want to encourage risk-taking because that's how students grow. That's how they acquire newer, more complex language. In the whole class format, where we're asking students to say something in front of the whole class, they often are too shy to do this. So putting them in groups or putting them in pairs encourages linguistic risk-taking. If we have them working with different people in the class, so I don't always pair one student with the same student, but I try to, mingle my students, and the same thing with the groups. I try to change group configuration. That can help for a more bonded class, and that, again, that will help motivation. And then finally, recognizing that social cooperation and teamwork are a really important life skill. So we can reinforce how important that is in the workplace by bringing it into our classrooms. I think all of these are good rationales. Some of this is from the article that I mentioned that I wrote on this topic. So this is from my article. It's actually, okay, questions or comments there? Make sense? Okay. This task says, let's look at the seating arrangements and let's see if we can find advantages and disadvantages of each arrangement. So let's look at these. So the one on the top left-hand side, students work with others in rows. That's the most traditional classroom format. And in many parts of the world, including the United States, that may be the only possible configuration in our classroom. I'm interested, like in your classroom in Ho Chi Minh City, in the classrooms that you teach in, is this the configuration that you typically have or find in your classrooms?
Again, Miss, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, if you look at that top left diagram with students in a row facing the front of the classroom with the teacher at the front of the classroom, is that the kind of situation that is most common in Ho Chi Minh City, for example?
Of course.
Yeah, of course.
Some centers, they use the second charge also, the round. The students will work in a circle.
Circle, okay, okay. Jen, what about you? What about what you're familiar with in your environment?
Currently, it's more like the one on the bottom right, because I'm working with babies. So.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So either with the bottom right or the top left.
Or the top left. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we don't always have control of the classroom that we're in, but it has a big impact on our teaching, right? Actually, at the university where I taught for many, many years, most of our classrooms looked like the one on the upper left-hand side. And in many cases, the chairs were bolted to the floor, so you didn't have the option of making it a big circle. And it wasn't my own classroom. I entered the classroom at 8 o'clock and I had to leave it at 10 o'clock in the morning, and another teacher came in, so they didn't always appreciate it. If I did have flexible seats, for example, if I moved them into a circle, I'd have to take time and move them back to the other configuration, and that was sometimes just too much trouble. But these have a big impact on our teaching. Do you have a favorite?
What did I say before? Did I say top left? I
Top
meant,
left?
yeah, no, I meant, I was going back. I was like, did I say top left? I meant bottom, bottom
Bottom,
right and bottom left.
bottom right and bottom left. Okay. Oh, bottom.
Okay, I'm
Okay.
getting
The
myself
table,
mixed
the
up.
tables and the horseshoe.
All right.
Tables, we could say tables, horseshoe, rows, and circle. That might be easier
Okay, yeah,
than,
because I'm
yeah.
just, yeah. Okay, so either the tables or the circles. Sorry.
Tables
Getting
are the
backwards.
circle. Okay. Yeah.
I would say, uh, the one, the one that I probably like more so with the kids that we have is probably the circle. As long as you're in the circle with them, because as soon as you leave the circle, then you got,
Total chaos.
yeah, kids
Yeah.
outside the circle, kids inside the circle. Sometimes the chairs are somewhere by the door. It's not in the circle anymore.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, at least in our diagram there, the teacher is part of the circle. So we can assume that the teacher there is part of the circle. And in the horseshoe, if we look at the bottom one, we see also that teacher is just sitting someplace in the horseshoe, not necessarily at the very front. Yeah. What about you? Do you have a preference for the students that you work with? And it may depend a lot on the students that you work with.
I'm working with the rows, but actually I prefer a circle.
Okay.
Because
And we
in the
don't, like I
circle,
said, go ahead.
because in the circle one, we have more space for games, for activities.
Okay. Yeah. I think my own preference has always been tables, but that's because I'm always working with adult learners, and, you know, very often we're doing like writing activities, and it's just nice to be able to do, you know, group brainstorming at a table. But I've worked with all of these, obviously, and they do, like I say, they have an impact on your classroom. Okay. My last sort of area that I wanted to talk about is teacher discourse, which very simply means the way that the teacher talks in the classroom. And it's a really popular topic for research today. A lot of research going on in what's called classroom discourse. So classroom discourse research. And classroom discourse research is turning up some really interesting and surprising things. One of my favorites, I'm not going to talk about it here today, but I'll mention it, is an article that's by Wong and Waring called "Very Good as a Teacher Response." Now, we probably as teachers think that if we say very good to our learners, that's a really good thing. And we're sort of encouraging them and we're motivating them. But they did a long-term study of teachers and their use of very good. And what they found was that whenever they said very good, it stopped the conversation and the students were suddenly silent and nothing happened after that. So that's an example of the kind of surprising like findings that we get out of classroom discourse research. Okay, so here's from Richards and Farrell again, and they say, language is used in many different ways in second language classrooms since it's both a means and an end of learning. A crucial aspect of language classes, therefore, is the way in which teachers use language to support and manage the processes of language learning. And I mentioned that lots of different things fall into this bigger category of classroom discourse, like the kinds of questions that I use in my classroom, or the ways in which I greet students, for example. But I'm only going to talk about one of them today, and that's a sequence that's really, really classic in the language classroom, which is called IRE or IRF. So, what is IRE? It stands for Initiation, Response, Evaluation. It's a three-part sequence. And this is where the teacher asks a question of a student, of a designated student. And then second, because the student was just asked a question, the student responds, either correctly or incorrectly. And then the teacher evaluates that response by saying good, or no, sorry, or that's not right, and moves on usually to another student. This is the most classic way that teachers conduct their classroom. IRE, initiation, response, evaluation. I ask a question, you answer the question, and I say, that's good, Or I might say, no, sorry, and then ask another student, right? And it ends with step 3. So like I said, the most common classroom discourse sequence. Here's an example, right? This is from research, pretty old research by Sinclair and Coulthard. And the teacher says, number 5, this is correcting homework, for example. Number 5, is it raining outside? 1, yes it is. Right. Number 6, Ali. And I move on to the next student. I haven't done very much in terms of getting that student to produce language. I told him you're correct, and I move on, right? So not much is happening in terms of the student's ability to grow and respond with anything personal. This is just sort of classroom routine language. Okay, here's the advantages and disadvantages according to Waring, 2007. She says, the advantages of IRE, this most common practice by classroom teachers, is it's very efficient, it moves really fast. If I'm correcting homework and I don't have much time to correct homework, great way to correct homework, right? It is what we call controlled practice. It doesn't get very much language, but I'm controlling what the students say. It can be useful because the students are displaying what they know. And if I reward them by saying good, then they feel good about it. But if I say, no, that was wrong, and I move on to another student, you don't know why what you said was wrong. You're not being given an explanation. So it's efficient, but not maybe the best thing for all of our classroom teaching. The disadvantages. First listed disadvantage says that this IRE sequence is typical of the transmission mode of learning. In other words, the teacher knows everything, the student doesn't know anything, and I then teach them something. I've transmitted knowledge to the student. And there's a lot of literature about this sort of idea of the transmission mode of learning not being the best approach to language teaching. Second thing that Waring lists as a disadvantage, she says, basically, I'm telling the student what to say. They're not answering anything from their personal experience, so we're not really negotiating meaning, if I could use that phrase again. There's no real communicative intent. I'm just moving through a sequence that is maybe not that meaningful or motivational for the students. And then it also puts the teacher in a power situation of saying this is right or this is wrong, and that might not be the right message to be giving our students. So this moves us on then to the second sequence, which is called IRF. Again, it's a 3-part sequence, right? Very similar to IRE, but according to the research, a better way to conduct our classes because it gives a better message to our students and it allows them more room for language growth and more room for personal response. And you'll see why in a minute. So the teacher, or a student in this case, asks a question. And somebody responds, one of the students responds to the question. And then whoever asked the question, let's assume it was the teacher, moves the conversation forward by asking another student the same question or varying the question just a little bit. And we can continue by chaining the questions and the responses as long as we want until we've exhausted the possibilities. I'll give you an example. Okay, so here's the teacher initiating. How many brothers and sisters have you got? Notice there's no correct answer to this question because it's a personal information question. And so student number 1 says 5. And the teacher then, instead of evaluating and saying good or bad, the teacher gives feedback. That's why this is called IRF. Wow, that's a big family. And then she continues by saying, now I'm asking for more open discussion, who else has got a big family? And I could continue by asking 6 or 7 students in the class to answer the same question. So now we've got something that's more like a real, authentic conversation where there's no correct answer, but everybody's giving answers based on their own personal experience, which is much more like what happens in the real world. Very simple and very important change or difference between these two kinds of sequences. So let's look here. So here's actual classroom discourse that people have collected. The teacher says, "Who can tell me the answer to the first question?" Angela. Angela says, "Turkey." Teacher, "Yes, that's right, turkey." Who can answer number 2? Mary, what do you have? Mary, "I put apples." Teacher, "Apples?" Tom, what did you put? IRE or IRF? If you were analyzing this from a classroom discourse perspective, would this be the teacher using an IRE sequence or an IRF sequence?
IRE?
Yeah, notice that she's evaluating, right? That's really important. So she's saying, who can tell me the answer? Angela, turkey. Yes, that's right. There's only one correct answer. Angela can't say something other than turkey because otherwise the teacher will say, "No, sorry, wrong," and move on to Mary and say, "Mary, what's the answer to the first question?" "Oh, turkey, right." Yeah. So there's only one correct answer and the teacher's giving an evaluation. Now, if you got it right, you feel good. But if you got it wrong, you're not going to feel very good and the teacher isn't going to do anything to help you. Plus, it's not personal information that they're communicating here, right? This is just sort of routine homework exercise that isn't very meaningful and probably not very motivational unless you really like turkeys a lot. Okay, let's look at the second one. Again, these are real teachers, real classroom discourse examples. So the teacher says, "What are some characteristics of crows?" Student 1, "Fly." Teacher, "They fly." What else? Student 2, "They're black." Teacher, "They're black." What else? Student 3, "They like homework." Teacher, "I didn't call on you, George." Student 4, "They screech." Teacher, "They screech, they caw." Daniel, "They squawk really loud." They squawk, they're loud. What else? You see a difference between this and the first sequence?
There aren't any responses related to right or wrong.
There's nothing right or wrong, except for maybe poor George, but he's the class clown and, you know, the teacher's just kind of using classroom management techniques there. She doesn't say you're wrong. She doesn't say they don't like homework. She just says, "I didn't call on you," right? But yeah, any response is possible. She's just collecting responses from students and they're answering from their experience or their knowledge, right? So probably a more motivational activity. So I just wanted to give you some real examples of what teachers do or don't do in the classroom. So kind of keep these in mind. You know, how many of us use IRE in the classroom? We use it all the time. Is it necessarily bad? No. There are reasons why we might use it, like quickly getting a homework activity done. But if that's all we use, then we're not really motivating our students. Okay. I think I'm 5 minutes over what I said, Sean, but I think we're finished here. But any last minute questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer.
It was really interesting as far as the different methods that you were explaining, like the actual names for the methods. I didn't really know, like the IRE, IRF. I never really heard.
I mean, you've certainly used them in the classroom,
Right.
but to know that there's actually a theory behind it and that people are monitoring that and looking at that and seeing, you know, what happens. Yeah, I think it's really interesting stuff. I'm not a classroom discourse analyst, but I really think that there's a lot of good stuff that's coming out of that research. And as teachers, you know, we need to sort of see what the research finds, because if we think saying very good to a student is a good thing, we have to also realize that it might not always be a good thing to say that to them, because it shuts them up and then we're trying to motivate them to talk more. Yeah.
I can see how important the warm-up activity is in the class, and I also like IRF.
You like IRF?
I usually use IRE in my class, but I have never known IRF.
Just think about, it's just a simple little difference, right? But maybe try it with your students and see what happens as a result. Maybe they'll start talking a little bit more. Maybe they'll be a little bit more motivated. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for your attention. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, but just too excited about what I'm talking about. I really like this. It's something I'm very, very interested in. Yeah.
That's totally fine. Thank you so much, Donna, for coming and presenting.